So welcome in everyone as we have people kind of still joining us. My name is Sammy Anderson. I'm our marketing manager here at Softcrylic. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your morning here to talk about what happens before your CDPs. We got Alex and Nats here to give a presentation around it. If you have any questions about what is presented, feel free to throw them in the chat or in the Q&A. If they don't get addressed throughout the presentation, we will send a follow-up or make sure to include it in our follow-up blog that will be up and live next week with this recording that will also get sent to you as well. If you have any question about our CDP services and how we can help you out with RFP, anything around the CDP, pre and post, reach out info@softcrylic.com. We do have a poll live, so feel free to take a look at that, answer the questions, and then just enjoy the presentation. I'll pass it off to you guys.
All right, thank you, Sammy. Welcome, guys. Today we are going to be talking about pre-CDP. Actually, introduce the concept of pre-CDP. There are multiple different definitions out there, in the internet for what a pre-CDP is. But we're going to talk about our version of what a pre-CDP is and its importance, to roll out a successful CDP implementation. Next slide. Yes. So my name is Nats Sivaramakrishnan. I am the VP of Architecture here at Softcrylic. I have like about 21 plus years of experience overall, and I've been associated with Softcrylic for about 11 years now. This is my 12th year. I have implemented applications, app engineering solutions, data solutions, big data solutions, MarTech data platforms, a variety of data solutions, and also more recently have been heavily involved in rolling out CDP solutions as well for our clients. I'm happy to be presenting this webinar with my co-presenter, Alex Owen, and I'll let him introduce himself now. Alex.
Yeah, hey everyone. My name's Alex. I'm the director of the data engineering practice here at Softcrylic. I've been with Softcrylic about 6 years now. Have a total of about 12 years experience. I also have spent a lot of time, several years, rolling out marketing platforms and have had the privilege of working on several CDP implementations that we've done. So tend to focus on the engineering side, but also have been involved in kind of the more business analysis, sort of developing marketing use cases. So I sort of bridge both sides of the aisle when it comes to our implementations.
Thank you, Alex. Can you move to the next slide? Sorry. All right, so today our agenda is going to go something like this. We are going to introduce Softcrylic, talk about briefly who we are and how do we roll out CDP solutions. Then we are going to introduce you to the concept of what a pre-CDP environment is and how it helps rolling out successful CDP implementations. Then I'll hand it over to Alex, and he will talk about some of the challenges that we saw implementing CDPs and what were its business impacts and how actually a pre-CDP solution that we put together helped us overcome some of the challenges. With that, we'll open the floor for questions and answer any questions that you guys might have. Now, this is going to be a two-part series, right? So this is part one, in which we are going to introduce you to the pre-CDP concepts. But in part two, we will actually talk about how a pre-CDP can be set up, how it needs to organize the data, and talk about specific use cases, from our real-time examples in the second part. So that is something that we will follow up with you guys and later on, and then set up some time with another webinar and explain. But for now, today, it's just more about introduction and then our learnings and how a pre-CDP can help us roll out a successful CDP environment. Next slide, Alex. So at Softcrylic, we like to call ourselves a data company, and we're broken down our company into multiple different practices. Starting from digital analytics, advanced analytics, activation, visualization, data science, app engineering, and data engineering, and so on and so forth. And now, when it comes to implementing a CDP, it's not just about rolling out the tool, right? Because it's about understanding how you organize your data. It's about how understanding how to set up your analytics workflow. It's about understanding how to orchestrate customer orchestrate customer workflows so that we can, it's about orchestrating activation workflows as well. So we have expertise in all these areas within these separate practices, and we have set up ourselves in such a way that we can bring in all this expertise together and then roll out a successful CDP implementation. And this sort of a setup through the solutions architecture group has made us really successful in rolling out a good CDP implementations. Next slide, Alex. So the last three years, I would say, we have rolled out like multiple different CDP solutions. And what we have learned is that the most important ingredient for a successful rollout of CDP is full and accurate profile data of a customer across all channels, right? And that is the most important piece. And what we have also learned is that if a CDP implementation takes about 6 months to roll out, at least 3 to 4 months is being spent on actually organizing and formulating that data. And then the remaining 2 to 3 months we actually spend on implementing and rolling out the CDPs, right? So we thought, like, rather than trying to do everything in the CDP, if we were to set up a pre-CDP environment as a data foundation that will enable the CDP to actually generate that identity graph of the audience, then it is much more faster with the rollout and implementation, and it helps enable activating all the marketing use cases much more easily, because it takes care of organizing your data effectively. It takes care of developing consistent keys to generate your identity graph for your customers. And it ensures your data readiness and completeness for you to be able to activate your marketing use cases. And it also reduces the amount of complex data wrangling workflows that you would need to implement within your CDP. Obviously, CDP comes with, solutions come with a lot of bells and whistles to wrangle your data, but when it comes to like complex workflows, you know, they don't really measure up to the level of data wrangling that we need to do. So to that end, our goal is to sort of set up an environment that will prep all the data to manage your marketing use cases effectively, and let your CDP implementation team actually focus on understanding the customer behavior, orchestrating the customer journey, and also focus on the activation use cases, as opposed to trying to manage the data and organize the data within the CDP environment. And that's the overall idea of a pre-CDP environment. Next slide, Alex. These are some of the, thank you. So these are some of the key benefits that we have seen, rolling out a CDP, pre-CDP environment, right? First thing is, like, it accelerates the CDP implementation, taking out of data management complexities from the CDP process itself. Because when we roll out CDPs, generally we identify top 5 use cases, and then set up the CDP to address that, and then gradually build on top of that. And so to that end, a pre-CDP environment will basically help us ensure the data completeness to address all those use cases without having to actually start working on the CDP implementation itself. And this can be like sort of a parallel activity that can go on, or even a prerequisite that will help you enable, accelerate the CDP implementation process. So then the next thing is data ownership. What we have seen is that if you were to manage all your data processing operations or data organizing operations within your CDP, and let's say that if the business decides to go a different direction, use another CDP later on, then all that intelligence that you put in to manage and handle the data will have to be re-implemented in another environment altogether. So because you are not owning that intelligence with you, but actually deploying it into another platform. So to that end, with the pre-CDP, you will be able to own all that intelligence and the data, and it allows you or provides the flexibility to switch around multiple different tools to orchestrate your marketing workflow and enable your use cases. The third thing is going beyond CDP, right? So if you were to organize your data effectively in your pre-CDP environment, then it can be used across multiple different use cases and not just the activation needs. For instance, if you are trying to implement data science workflows outside of your CDP implementation, then you will have the data coming from a single source of truth, presenting the same story for all the downstream consumers who will be accessing this data. Then finally, lower cost of implementation. Obviously, CDP implementation, generally takes like millions of dollars and a lot of time. And with a pre-CDP, you organizing and managing your data effectively, the time that is spent on actually rolling out the CDP significantly goes down. And it's going to be great value as you are exploring multiple different options to activate and manage your marketing use cases. Thank you. So I just want to touch upon the first point that I just made earlier today, which is like delivering good customer experiences. Like, it depends upon full and accurate profile of your customer, right? And pre-CDP can actually help you do that. So this, you have all your data sources coming from various different places. You organize all that data in your pre-CDP environment and then push to multiple different downstream systems. This is like a 5,000-foot view. The biggest benefit here is that you are going to be able to deliver your data from a single source of truth, and you are able to move across multiple different, you're able to use multiple different tools to activate your marketing use cases. So basically this acts as your data foundation. It organizes your data by line of business based on the use cases that you want to address. And most importantly, allows you to manage all your data quality and data consistency, so that you don't have the segmentation that you create in your CDPs are much more accurate. Okay. So now with this, I'm going to hand over to Alex, who will further talk about the actual business challenges that we've faced in implementing CDP and how a pre-CDP environment is across various areas. Over to you, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Nats. Yeah, so I'm going to dive into some of the challenges that we've seen, right? That Nats has alluded to many of these, but we'll go a little bit more detail. So first one, the biggest thing we've seen, right, is that there's a tendency to just try to bring in all the data into CDP, right? Everyone likes the idea of having like every piece of data at their fingertips, right? So we see our clients bringing in data from all sorts of different sources, and it's really just difficult to manage. As Nat said, there are some data wrangling capabilities in CDPs, but they really are not super robust. It's not like you just have it's like a SQL server and you can just do whatever you need. It's not a data warehouse, right? So what we tend to see is that there's a lot of confusion with all the data that's coming in. There's redundant data, meaning that you get the same kind of data point from multiple different sources, and you don't need it, right? You don't need all that data. There's just so much of it that it causes all these different duplicate data points, and it really leads to inaccurate segmentation because marketers don't know what exactly they should be using. There's inconsistencies for which data points they use. And so there's actually more data does not actually lead to better results. And so, and you really just kind of really increase the data volume for kind of no reason in that regard, right? And it's, so I said before, it's possible to do some amount of cleaning in the CDP environment, but it's not easy. And so what happens is we tend to have things coming in different formats, multiple different vendors sending things in different kind of, with different taxonomies and things like that. And you get this huge wealth of data, but it becomes very difficult to use for the primary activation use cases that you want to use it for. And so we'll talk more about kind of impact and solutions here next, but these are some of the challenges that we're seeing, right? So this leads to mediocre segmentation, right? So it is difficult to build quality segments with unprepped data. Couple reasons why. One is that oftentimes what you're trying to segment on is more of like a KPI. It's not some raw metric or something that's coming from a vendor. It's something you want to calculate. And you can try to do that. There's different, obviously, use cases, but you can try to do that in your segmentation builder tool, right? And sometimes that works well, certainly, but oftentimes it doesn't. And it can be a lot better to kind of be able to calculate these KPIs and feed them in if they're going to be commonly used for segmentation. And if you're bringing stuff in directly from all your different sources, oftentimes that's not going to be in your data. And so oftentimes there's have to be compromises about what you can do. And so your segmentation just won't be as good as it can be. And the tools in the CDP obviously vary by CDP, but they will allow you to do some amount of aggregations and things like that. But it's not a SQL query that you can just write. So there's limitations there. And so if you have commonly used KPIs that you want to be able to segment off of, it is often much easier to sort of pre-calculate that. And probably in the next session, we'll talk a little bit more through use cases because there's a balancing act with that. But we definitely see segmentation, not being as good as it can be because of the unprepped data that's coming through. Another one is identity management. So of course, the goal of the CDP is to be able to properly stitch your data coming from across sources, right? Create that single source of 360-degree, view of the customer, right? That's the goal. But once the data is coming into the CDP, usually there's not a lot of control of how that stitching happens. You are setting up your feeds to identify, different identities, right? Fields, right? And then then the identity graph does its work. But with the data coming in uncleaned and unprepped, there can be a lot of issues that you run into when you're trying to do that stitching, right? The CDP is not going to be super efficient if your identity fields have formatting issues, right? Phone number is one of my favorite examples of this. Even within a given data source, the formatting of phone number often we see is like different, right? Because there's no control. The vendor doesn't, control whether you put in, dashes or whatnot. One source can have the phone number coming with an area code embedded in that field. Another has it as a separate field. All these things, if you want to use that field for identity, and you haven't done any sort of cleaning, you run into a lot of challenges with that, right? The other thing is that we see confused identity, where the identity graph has been set up to, if it matches on that field, it's stitching, right? But the concept of shared emails exists, right? And so and other types of things that you may not want to merge identities, right? And so you don't have a lot of control over that in the CDP. And so you if you're bringing in data and configuring it a certain way to stitch on certain identity fields, you're basically leaving it up to the CDP to do what it needs to do, but you don't have as much granular control. And we do see a lot of kind of identity management issues, basically when data is being brought in directly from the source. The other one is that I alluded to is the unmerged, right? So you do have valid identities that you want to be able to merge, but because of those data quality problems, they're not able to be stitched, and you don't really have an enriched profile at that point. Last piece here about data inflexibility, right? So as Nats alluded to in his diagram, activation in the CDP is one of the use cases, maybe the primary use case for your data, right? But it's not the only one. And a lot of times there's other sorts of either downstream systems and applications you want to deliver that data to, or a really common one is, more complex reporting that you want to do, right? There are usually capabilities in the CDP to do reporting, but it's not a reporting platform compared to the reporting platforms you probably use, right? So if you want to do complex reporting, other data intensive use cases, right? It can be difficult to manage that directly out of the CDP. And so it oftentimes most CDPs offer some ability to extract data, but it's usually not that easy. In our experience, we found a lot of challenges with that. All right, so I'm going to move on to the impacts of some of these things, right? So one of the primary ones is rising costs. And we've seen this happen to numerous customers where they're expecting to pay a certain amount because they understand conceptually kind of how many customers they have. And then in the reality, what the CDP is charging them is way higher than what they were expecting, right? Now, CDPs can have a couple of different pricing models. They can be based upon stitched profiles. They can be based upon, there's some that have data volume considerations, overall data volume considerations. But a big one is the stitched profiles, right? So the data quality problems that I alluded to or talked about in the last slide that cause profiles to fail to merge can really jack up the price of your overall solution. If you have data coming in from lots of different sources, it hasn't been prepped, it hasn't been cleaned, records are having difficulty, fragments are having difficulty stitching, over your distinct profile count starts climbing, and it really your costs just start going up. And a lot of times it really takes people by surprise when those costs start monthly charges start going up and up, right? So that's one thing, and these are like valid records failing to merge, right? But then there's also data that you're getting back that's either anonymous, right? So you're never going to have a chance to merge it at this point, or it's basically unstitchable. So it comes back without any sort of identity that could be used, and so really you're bringing in all this data, but you're going to get hit with those fragments basically being considered profiles. So again, different CDPs operate differently, but we do see this as an overall big challenge, and it has a lot of impact and from a cost perspective. In a lot of these cases, right, that data that's causing all this rising cost isn't even applicable to activation use cases, right? So a big, one of the things that we really find is that there was a desire to bring all this data in, but it wasn't because the customer was going to use that data in activation immediately. It was just more of it makes sense to bring everything in, right? So this rise in costs can really be, a lot of it can be attributed to data that is not actually even attempted to be used in activation use cases. So that's one. The other one is poor targeting. So all these stitching issues, cause either a reduced enrichment of profiles, so it failed to merge, right? And this can lead to underutilization of your targeting use cases, right? So you're trying to build these customer profiles that have online, offline, attributes so that you can make more sophisticated segments and build better audiences. But when you have these stitching issues, you're in a position where even though theoretically you have the data, it hasn't been basically merged in a way that you can actually use it to build out those more complex audiences that will have, being attributes across different sources, right? So that's one way that your targeting can suffer, as well as the identities being merged incorrectly. And so we see that there's a couple different ways that that can happen. Obviously, like some sort of shared email or something is one, but there's also, depending on how you guys are targeting and sending out campaigns, you can bring in more than, there's different ways that basically identity can get confused. And if you're not cleaning, if you're not being rigid, you're not using some sort of customer ID that you're setting deliberately, it can really, cause that basically accidental or incorrect merging. And that can lead to ineffective messaging, right? Because you're not targeting the right person. A lot of this happens, and so audiences become stagnant. And what I mean by that is that because the marketing team struggles to, there's two things here. One is that they might know that these problems exist, and so they tend not to build more complex audiences, as I just described. But the other one is that you have so much data coming in. There's so many redundant data points, as I talked about in the last slide. So much duplicate data that it's difficult for marketing teams to build segments and activate on new audiences. And so they tend to stick to the data points they know, but because there are so many of them, they have struggled to kind of be flexible and nimble and be able to kind of activate on new audiences as you have you want to do optimizations to your campaign, you want it to hit new audiences, but it tends to stagnate because of that, because of the overwhelming amount of data that's there. This can lead to slower rollout of campaigns on fewer in-flight optimizations, because there's just no clarity about really what that should be used, right? And like I said, the confusion on data points is a big one that we see. Depending on how you set up your CDP, you can get the same fields or the same data points basically from multiple different sources. And if you haven't cleaned any of that stuff, you haven't kind of tried to slim down your data sets to just be what's used for activation, it becomes a real issue with trying to understand how best to create these segments and target your audiences. Last point here is about insight. So, you have that, again, you have all this data and redundant data. And so reporting gets a lot harder because not quite sure for the same reason for segmentation, what of those data points should be used in reporting and trying to understand performance, right? And so it can clutter up your reporting and really kind of hinder your campaign optimizations because you're not as sure of what's going on, right? And so, activation strategies can really suffer as you're trying to understand how better to optimize your campaigns and plan for the next ones. But because of the reporting that you're doing in the CDP on top of all this data, it's a challenge. So there's all these impacts. So the next thing we're going to talk about is really, well, how can we fix this, right? How can a pre-CDP help? So the first big point is you're able to do a lot of advanced data wrangling, right? You're going to have your separate environment for data prep. You can ensure that all the data that's coming from your vendor is clean and usable once it's sent into the CDP. This is a huge, huge benefit, right? You're at the mercy when you directly import data from any sort of one of your data sources, right? Maybe that's a first-party data source that you have some control over already, but a lot of times that's not, right? Data is directly coming from some vendor. The way that they have organized the data in terms of the structure is, you're at the mercy of that. The actual quality of the data, what data points or how the data in those data points is coming through, you're totally at the mercy of how the vendor is sending the data. So here, you're going to be able to, clean everything, what you want, how you want it to be structured in your own environment first. You can also remove all this redundant data that I've been kept talking about. And you can remove all that stuff. You can basically streamline it so that what you're sending into the CDP is what you need for activation, right? And that's really the most important piece here, is that It helps simplify what marketers see, what they can use, reporting that you're doing in the CDP. It really makes everything function so much better when you've already made a deliberate decision about which ones of these data points that you need for activation, and that is what you're basically prepping and sending through as clean data from each one of these sources, right? The other thing is that you have the opportunity to pre-calculate some of the KPIs you might need for segmentation. So every customer has different use cases, right? But if you have common things that you segment on and are part of a larger piece of a more complex segment, it's often much easier to compute that and send it through. It's not to say that we recommend, pre-calculating and sending through every, huge number of pre-calculated metrics, and we'll discuss a little bit more in the next session. But the commonly used ones, it can be really beneficial for your marketers to kind of receive that and be able to segment off it very easily. And so it helps to kind of increase rollout of campaigns and in-flight optimizations, because you're going to be able to be more flexible, be able to quickly set those things up as you see in the data that you need, right? Identity alignment, right? So the goal of Pre-CDP is really so that what data you send into the CDP can be stitched efficiently by the identity graph in the CDP, right? So the best way that we've seen to do that is making sure that there's customer IDs are set, and other identity fields that you may be using in telling the identity graph to key off of, right, are properly set for each of the data sources that you're sending through. That may mean removing records that basically don't have those things correctly, or if you do have the concept of a client ID or a customer ID, a customer ID that you're basically identifying and putting into that data that the vendor might not have, right? You can really prep your data so that when it gets fed into the pre-CDP, into the CDP, the identity graph works, well. It's very deliberate. You're not going to get a lot of surprises with stuff that doesn't merge or does merge incorrectly, right? Because you've really taken the effort and built the intelligence into your pre-CDP to make sure that that data is cleaned and has the identities that you're expecting, right? So that really is a key piece of this. It's not that the stitching is done in the pre-CDP, but it is that it basically ensures that once it gets into the CDP and that it is going to behave the way that you're expecting it to behave. Next point on CDP feeds, right? So one of the things that we've seen is that when you are directly importing into CDP, you're bringing in data from all over the place. You have to build all that stuff in the CDP environment, but to configure all these feeds, and it can be overwhelming, and you're kind of constrained by the CDP and how that is set up, which it may not be a tool that you've worked with before, right? If you have a pre-CDP environment, your team can bring in that data into a environment that you own and you're comfortable with, and really then you're sending all of these feeds into the CDP from your pre-CDP environment in the same method, right? There can be multiple feeds, right? It doesn't mean there's just one feed, but they'll all have a similar implementation, right? So then, when you go to set up and roll out your CDP, it's very much more streamlined, and you can have a common way to ingest data. You can have, your different, sending through batch or whatever your use case may dictate. It doesn't. I want to make the point that we're not saying that it's going to completely eliminate the possibility that you will want to bring in data directly into the CDP, right? There's use cases, real-time use cases. There may be things that you want to bring in directly. But having a pre-CDP environment will really streamline how you are bringing in the majority of your data. The other key piece that I'll keep driving home the point is that you're only sending, if you can only send the data that's required for activation, it's really going to help better organize, what's in your CDP and improve the ability to activate on that data and reduce the clutter, right? So one of the things that we suggest is that, if you look at if a marketer looks at a data point, they could probably in their head come up with a use case for it, like, oh, I could use that in this way, right? But the question is, are you actually going to activate on that data point within, the next 6 months? And so when we're doing implementations, we often try to work with, our customers to understand, what are they actually going to activate on? What are the data points needed for those activation use cases, and roll that out iteratively, right? We find in CDPs, it's much easier to add data. You can continually sort of grow your schemas and the data points you're bringing in and organize it, over time. Whereas once you kind of commit to just sending everything in, it can get really cluttered really fast and unorganized. So we really advocate for only sending the data points you need for activation. And this will also, just overall reduce your data volume and complexity in the CDP and really make usability much better. Last point here about, having your data in a pre-CDP that Natch touched upon about owning that intelligence, right? That's one, right? That you have, everything I just talked about, you own, right? In your own environment. But also you have that data in a place that is easy to then use for other use cases. The CDP does allow you, and most CDPs allow you to take out data, but there's a lot of, it can be difficult. And so if you have the data in your environment, you're going to be able to do what you need with it whenever you need with it on your schedule and not have to fight with the CDP basically to allow you to do that. You can have, your reporting use cases, complex reporting use cases, feed it into your dashboards, your data science workloads, any of your other kind of, maybe third-party vendors you need to send data to, or, other sorts of applications that you maintain, and you can, easily just develop by yourself and send that data in, right? And so it really enables you to use your data for more use cases. And the other thing is that, and the last point I'll make is that with your data in a pre-CDP environment, it'll enable your business users, potentially marketers as well, to do more exploration of that data and more being able to have an environment where it's easy to explore some of the data. The CDPs are really good tools for stitching this data together, being able to activate it on it easily. But it's not a great place to just try to do data exploration. It's not developed for that. And so having your data in a pre-CDP environment gives a much easier place for business users to look at that raw data, to do more detailed analysis, and potentially kind of explore it just in a place it's easier to really access that data. Depending on the CDP you're using, it's usually the loading and the management of that data is really not something an end user of the tool or marketer would use. So all in all, we're really, a rollout of the CDP is pretty complex. And so, our feeling is that having this pre-CDP environment really gives you a place to own all of that kind of logic, all that intelligence, and be able to have much more control over what goes into the CDP, how it's going to, streamline the efforts to implement, and really make the whole process of rolling out the CDP a lot easier for you. All right, so with that, Nats, do you want to add anything before we roll into questions?
Yeah, I think that as a final point, I would like to say that the pre-CDP environment that we're recommending does not replace any sort of capabilities, that comes along with CDP, and that's not the intent. It's all about data ownership, It's all about deriving efficiency around rolling out CDPs within a short period of time, as opposed to, it's just about playing by strengths, right? CDP is a tool that does certain things really good. And so how do we aid that to accelerate the implementation process? And so that's the idea. It's more of a catalyst. It's more of a technology enabler as opposed to a platform or an environment that competes with a CDP, right? So that's the idea here. And we have actually implemented this, and we've seen the benefits as well as part of some of our CDP implementations. And this way it works. So, but thank you, guys. So we can move on to the questions.
All right.
I don't see any in the Q&A or in the chat. If you guys have one that you want to speak to, you can feel free to raise your hand and we can give you access to talk. Otherwise, if there's any other points you guys want to drive home. Joe says, thank you.
Apart from media targeting, how else can a CDP help? This is a question from Mitten. So CDP has multiple different benefits, right? So it's about organizing your customer data. It's about stitching your customer data and then developing the identity graph. It's about understanding a customer journey, where he came from, how is he getting converted. It's about activating and targeting customers. And then it's also about orchestrating journeys to really trigger workflows within your digital assets to manage, to better enable the customer to convert or target him back again, to do retargeting. So it's not just about media targeting, it's about understanding your customer, managing the journey orchestration, developing the identity of the customer over time, understanding his shopping patterns and things like that. All right, so there's a question from Nasim. It says, do you also support the implementation of CDP? And if so, which ones? So yes, our primary expertise lies in implementing and rolling out CDPs. And deploying a pre-CDP environment, as I said, is more of an accelerator or enabler to speed up the implementation process of CDPs. And we have expertise rolling out Adobe, then Action IQ, and we are also working with Salesforce CDP implementations as well. So there's a question from Oliver, and it says, if my applications are creating data in different formats, 8 to 9 different applications, what can I do to unify the data? Can I do that in CDP, or do I need to do it upstream? All right, so like Alex pointed out earlier, you cannot bring your data assets into your CDP environment and then try to organize it within CDP. So take, for example, your shopping cart experience, right? In a typical application, the user shopping experience data would be managed with like order header, order line items, and shopping coupons, then product catalog, then payment details and things like that. And the data is distributed across multiple different tables in relational format. And that same data cannot be ingested as into CDP environments. Then it becomes extremely complex to manage the data in the first place, and also develop the identity for the user, right? Because there are too many joins, and so you need to organize that data appropriately. And also, you don't need to bring in all the data. You just need to push the data that's only required for your activation use cases within the CDP. So to that end, you need to organize all this data, ensure that this data is of good quality and has all the attributes that will help or enable the CDP to really stitch the data efficiently and develop that identity graph, right? So it needs to be done upstream, and that is this pre-CDP environment that we're talking about here. So Alex, if you would like to add anything else.
Yeah, just to hit on, you're talking about, shopping data, but this applies to many different types of data. You may need to, for activation, you may only need to know certain key things or aggregated, information from that, like, let's say, point of sale data, right? Because you're going to segment based upon, total amount spent or something like that, right? So bringing in detailed, product level data may be not applicable to your activation use cases. And so we've seen challenges that customers bring in kind of, as you're describing, directly from the source. And then even if they're able to kind of organize it or manage to kind of connect some of those tables, as that's alluding to, it's the data is overwhelming, and it doesn't really quickly allow marketers to target or build segments and target audiences as they want, because it's not the format it comes in is just not meant to be what is used for segmentation. So the idea behind the pre-CDP is really to give you an opportunity to format the data in the way that is going to be most efficiently used for activation use cases in CDP. And there is some ability to do, some data wrangling in the CDP, but it just really doesn't, it doesn't work as well as, it's much preferable to try to really organize that data upstream, and it'll really kind of accelerate how fast you can roll out campaigns and activate.
Right. So next question is from Steve Topper. So this question is, should you do this first prior to selecting what CDP you are going to use, or maybe help in that decision? Or should you deploy this and a CDP at the same time? So I think, like, first we need to finalize and prioritize the use cases, and also the organization's marketing and activation needs, because those are the ones that will actually drive the choice of CDP that you might want to use, right? And your use cases will definitely drive this marketing data foundation or the pre-CDP environment that we are talking about. So this does not have any bearing on choosing and deploying your CDP. That is a separate activity. This is something that you can implement in a standalone way. And it's always better to finalize your use cases, make sure your data is arranged, that you have all the data that you need to actually activate on those use cases, and then start your CDP implementation. And that would basically accelerate your CDP implementation timeline, and also save you a lot of money, because so that's a recommendation. Pramit, how does CDP handle both structured and unstructured data? Yes, CDP does have tools to ingest both structured and unstructured data. It's a matter of configuring those appropriate data connectors and ingesting that data into your environment, and then stitching it. So yeah, it does have tools. What is the role of CDP in web and app experience? Can you elaborate on that question, Mithun? Alex, are you following?
I think actually Mithun did. I am asking in context of a conglomerate's corporate website, how can CDP help? Where a lot of people who visit without logging in.
So CDP is generally used to understand the audience who are coming in, and then to basically understand their shopping behavior or how they use your digital assets, and to target them and then activate campaigns on that, right? And it also essentially is primarily used for managing your first party data. And so to that end, we need to definitely understand what the use case that you're trying to solve to be able to, before answering that question. But in a nutshell, that's what CDPs are generally used for.
But in CDPs, there's a lot of capabilities for journey orchestration, right? So trying to identify, what would be the, trigger certain types of actions, right? Personalization or other types of things, right? So a big part of the CDP is trying to understand who that person is, and it might not be something that their exact email or something like that, but you can start to build out kind of profiles for people, and when they visit, you can drive them towards a certain different experience based upon other data points you've collected, both either online or offline, if you're able to stitch that. So it's about building this customer profile for these people, and it can be enriched really well if you can identify who they are and connect it to, let's say, your CRM. But that isn't necessarily a requirement. You can still get benefit from it if it's and if it's not stitched to that CRM data, and you can create these experiences using through these customer journeys that you can configure, and really get triggered by certain events that they're taking, that person is taking on your digital asset.
Thanks, Alex. So Oliver, you had made a comment saying like, sounds like pre-CDP is going to be 95% of the work, but no, it's not. As I said, it's just a catalyst and it enables a CDP implementation, but it's not 95% of the work. Yes, it helps you organize the data. It helps you develop strong data identity keys that could help CDPs merge all this data together and stitch all this data together, but it does not do the work that what a CDP does, and so it's not 95% of the work.
I will say that you're basically in a position when you're bringing data in directly to a CDP where you're gonna be attempting to do that sort of cleaning and prep. And you're really moving it to an environment where you can do it better. Because at the end of the day, they're going to be struggling with those problems and challenges that we talked about in CDP, or be basically getting ahead of the problems by managing that in pre-CDP. So it's about where it is best to do that sort of prep work and organization so that your rollout of CDP is smooth. But yeah, to Nats's point, the CDP is still doing, that identity graph is doing what it does best, right? And it's stitching together, and that's how you can activate on these things, and all the segmentation and the work to build out all your audiences, right? And all those journeys that I just talked about, the creating those journeys and stuff, all of that is going to be in the CDP, and that's what it does best. And the pre-CDP is not trying to replace that. It really is just trying to aid how well the CDP can work to do all those things, because it will have clean prep data that's organized appropriately. So really the CDP can do what it just does best.
Next question from Nazim is, from your experience, what are the pros and cons of Salesforce CDP since it's relatively new? Now, all CDPs have pros and cons, but it's all about understanding what our use cases are, what are we trying to accomplish with it, and whether measuring CDPs benefits based off of what we need to implement and roll out. We cannot really make a blanket statement and then say these are the pros and cons of various CDPs and then compare them. It's totally driven by use cases and the organization goals and the marketing team's vision on how they want to target their customers and what capabilities they need to really address those use cases. And final question from Rahul is any challenges that you may want to talk about real-time targeting use cases, data privacy and compliance, and any best practices. So this is something that we can definitely touch upon as part of our part 2 series of how pre-CDP environments can help. But as part of this session, this is something. This is a big topic, and it's not easy to answer the question and talk about it.
One of the things that
2 minutes.
I'll touch on is that pre-CDP environment is, and we didn't really talk about it in today's session, but it's a really good place to try to manage the consents, right? And so it help, consent management can be organized in your pre-CDP, and it can really help take that challenge out of the CDP. So some of that we can talk about in our next session, as well as where the kind of some of the more of the real-time use cases come in. And as I did mention in my session, some of that real-time data you will be trying to bring still, even with a pre-CDP, bringing directly into the CDP to facilitate some of that. So we can talk a little bit more about what that looks like.
All right, so with that, I think that's all we have time for today, and we're going to wrap up the session. But once again, thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate your questions and your participation in this webinar. And once we finalize the dates for part 2 of this pre-CDP series, we will get in touch with you guys and answer some of your further questions. Thank you all once again. Appreciate it.
Excellent.
Thank you, Sammy, for organizing these
Thanks,
topics.
Thank you, Nats. Thanks, Sammy. All right, guys, take care. See you on the next session.